Picture this: a remote island shrouded in mist, surrounded by treacherous seas, where ancient stones stand as silent witnesses to forgotten civilizations. For thousands of years, this land has been conquered, divided, united, and transformed countless times. From the mysterious builders of Stonehenge to the empire upon which the sun never set, this is the story of a nation that would come to shape the entire world. But here's what most people don't realize about the United Kingdom's history. It's not just one story. It's the collision of dozens of different peoples, cultures, and civilizations, all fighting for control of these islands. The Celts, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans. Each group left their mark, and each conquest rewrote the destiny of these lands forever. What I'm about to show you is the complete, unfiltered story of how a collection of warring tribes on a foggy island became the most powerful empire in human history. We're going to witness brutal invasions, legendary kings, devastating plagues, and revolutionary ideas that changed everything. This isn't just British history. This is the foundation of the modern world as we know it. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll understand why the story of the United Kingdom is really the story of how civilization itself evolved. Every major development in law, democracy, industry, and global trade can be traced back to what happened on these islands. But we can't start with kings and queens. We have to go back much, much further. Back to a time when these islands weren't even islands at all. Imagine Britain 450,000 years ago. The landscape would be completely unrecognizable to us today. Massive ice sheets covered most of the land, and what we now call the English Channel was nothing more than a river valley. Britain was connected to mainland Europe by a vast land bridge, allowing early humans to simply walk across from what is now France and Belgium. These weren't modern humans like you and me. These were our ancient ancestors, Homo heidelbergensis, and they were living in one of the harshest environments imaginable. Woolly mammoths, cave bears, and saber-toothed cats roamed the frozen landscape. Survival meant constant movement, following herds of animals and seeking shelter in caves during the brutal winters. The evidence of these early inhabitants is scattered and precious. Archaeologists have uncovered hand axes crafted with the oldest in the world, and the among skilled wooden spears that are remains of campsites where our ancestors gathered around fires to share food and stories. These people weren't just surviving, they were developing the first technologies, the first social structures, and the first attempts at understanding their world. But here's where the story gets fascinating. Around 400,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. The climate began to warm, the ice sheets retreated, and sea levels rose dramatically. That land bridge connecting Britain to Europe, it disappeared beneath the waves, creating the English Channel we know today. For the first time in geological history, Britain became an island. This single event would define everything that followed. Being surrounded by water meant that every group of people who wanted to live in Britain had to make a conscious decision to cross dangerous seas. It meant that invasions required careful planning and massive resources. It meant that ideas, cultures, and technologies would develop in isolation before colliding with outside influences in explosive ways. The rising seas also meant that many groups of early humans were now trapped on the island. Some adapted and thrived. Others disappeared entirely. This pattern of isolation, followed by dramatic contact, would repeat itself over and over throughout British history. As the Ice Age finally ended around 10,000 years ago, Britain transformed into a land of dense forests, flowing rivers, and abundant wildlife. The people living there had evolved too. They were now anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, with the same intelligence and creativity that we possess today. These Mesolithic people, as archaeologists call them, developed sophisticated hunting techniques and began to understand the seasonal patterns of their environment. They built temporary shelters, crafted intricate tools from bone and antler, and most importantly, they began to leave behind evidence of spiritual beliefs. Starkar in Yorkshire has revealed wooden platforms, ritual headdresses made from deer antlers, and the earliest evidence of symbolic behaviour in Britain. But the real revolution was yet to come. Around 4000 BC, something happened that would change everything about how humans lived on these islands. New people arrived from mainland Europe, bringing with them knowledge that would transform Britain forever. Agriculture. These Neolithic farmers didn't just bring seeds and livestock. They brought an entirely new way of understanding the world. Instead of following herds of wild animals, they could create permanent settlements. Instead of gathering whatever food nature provided, they could control their own food supply. Instead of small family groups, they could support large communities with specialized roles. The transformation was breathtaking. Within just a few centuries, vast areas of ancient forest were cleared to make way for fields and pastures. Permanent villages sprang up across the landscape, and most remarkably, these communities began working together on massive construction projects that still leave us speechless today. The monuments they built weren't just impressive, they were impossible by any reasonable standard. Silbury Hill in Wiltshire is a man-made mountain, the largest prehistoric structure in Europe. It contains over 12 million cubic feet of chalk and earth, all moved by hand using nothing but primitive tools. The effort required would be equivalent to building a modern skyscraper using only shovels and baskets. But Silbury Hill was just the beginning. Across Britain, Neolithic communities were creating stone circles, burial chambers, and ceremonial complexes that required incredible organization, mathematical knowledge, and astronomical understanding. These weren't primitive people stumbling through life. They were sophisticated engineers, mathematicians, and astronomers. The most famous of these monuments, of course, is Stonehenge. But here's what most people don't realize about Stonehenge. What we see today is just the final version of a monument that was built, rebuilt, and modified over more than 1,500 years. The site began as a simple earthwork around 3100 BC, but each generation added to it, creating something more complex and more mysterious. The massive stones we associate with Stonehenge, some weighing up to 50 tons, were dragged from quarries over 150 miles away. Think about that for a moment. Using only ropes, wooden rollers, and human muscle power, Neolithic people moved stones the size of modern trucks across hundreds of miles of rough terrain. The logistics alone would challenge modern engineers. But why? Why would people invest so much time, energy, and resources into these monuments? The answer reveals something profound about how these communities understood their world. These weren't just buildings. They were calendars, computers, and temples all rolled into one. Stonehenge is precisely aligned with the movements of the sun and moon. On the summer solstice, the sun rises directly over the heel stone when viewed from the center of the circle. During the winter solstice, it sets perfectly between the great trilithons. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of centuries of careful observation and mathematical calculation. These monuments were the centers of Neolithic society. They were where communities gathered for seasonal festivals, where the dead were honored, where knowledge was passed down from generation to generation. They represent the first attempt by humans in Britain to create something permanent, something that would outlast their own lives and connect them to both their ancestors and their descendants. But the Neolithic period was also marked by something else, the first evidence of social hierarchy in Britain. The massive effort required to build these monuments couldn't have been organized without leadership. Someone had to coordinate the work, someone had to possess the astronomical knowledge, and someone had to have the authority to command the labor of hundreds of people. We can see this hierarchy in the burial practices of the time. While most people were buried in simple graves, a few individuals were interred in elaborate tombs filled with precious objects. Jade axes from the Alps, amber from the Baltic, and gold from Ireland all found their way to Britain, suggesting trade networks that spanned the entire continent. This wasn't just about wealth, it was about power. The people buried with these exotic objects weren't just rich, they were the leaders, the priests, the keepers of knowledge who made the Neolithic revolution possible. They were the first rulers of Britain, and their influence can be traced in every monument, every settlement, and every artifact they left behind. As we move deeper into the Neolithic period, we see these communities becoming increasingly sophisticated. They developed new technologies for working stone, bone, and wood. They created the first pottery in Britain, with distinctive styles that allow archaeologists to track the movement of ideas and people across the islands. They domesticated new crops and livestock, creating a more reliable food supply that could support larger populations. But perhaps most importantly, they developed the first systems of belief that would echo through British culture for thousands of years to come. The reverence for sacred landscapes, the importance of seasonal festivals, the connection between the living and the dead, all of these concepts that we associate with later Celtic and even Christian traditions can be traced back to these Neolithic pioneers. The stage was now set for the next great transformation. Around 2500 BC, new people would arrive in Britain, bringing with them a revolutionary technology that would change warfare, agriculture, and society forever. They brought bronze, and with it, they brought the Bronze Age. But that's a story for our next chapter, because what happened when bronze-working peoples encountered the sophisticated Neolithic communities of Britain would reshape these islands once again, setting in motion events that would eventually lead to the rise of the Celtic peoples who would dominate Britain for the next 2 millennia. The foundations had been laid. The island was no longer just a wilderness to be survived. It was a landscape to be shaped, controlled, and ruled. The people who would inherit this legacy were about to discover just how powerful that inheritance could be. The arrival of bronze changed everything. Around 2500 BC, new waves of people began crossing the dangerous waters separating Britain from continental Europe. These weren't just migrants looking for new hunting grounds. They were master craftsmen carrying the secrets of metalworking, and they were about to revolutionize British society in ways that would echo for millennia. These Bronze Age peoples, known to archaeologists as the Boudica culture because of their distinctive pottery, didn't come as conquerors. Instead, they integrated with the existing Neolithic communities, intermarrying and sharing knowledge. But the technology they brought was so transformative that within just a few generations, the entire character of British civilization had changed. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was harder, more durable, and infinitely more versatile than anything that had come before. Stone axes that took days to craft could be replaced by bronze tools made in hours. Wooden spears tipped with flint became bronze-headed weapons capable of piercing the toughest hide armor. Agricultural tools became more efficient, allowing farmers to clear more land and harvest more crops. But here's what made this period truly revolutionary. Bronze wasn't just better than stone, it was scarce. The copper and tin needed to make bronze weren't found everywhere. This scarcity created the first real economy in British history, complete with trade networks, specialised craftsmen, and accumulation of wealth that would fundamentally alter social structures. Cornwall, in the far southwest of Britain, became incredibly important during this period because it had some of the richest tin deposits in Europe. Suddenly, this remote corner of the island was connected to trade routes stretching from Ireland to the Mediterranean. Bronze Age merchants were carrying Cornish tin to France, Spain, and even as far as modern-day Turkey. This wasn't just trade, it was the beginning of globalization. Bronze Age Britain was no longer isolated. Ideas, technologies, and cultural practices were flowing back and forth across vast distances. Archaeological evidence shows that Bronze Age British craftsmen were producing goods that matched the quality of anything being made in the great civilizations of the Mediterranean. The social changes were just as dramatic as the technological ones. For the first time in British history, we see clear evidence of a warrior class. Bronze swords, shields, and armour appear in burials across the country. These weren't ceremonial objects, they show clear signs of use in battle. Britain was becoming a more violent, more stratified society. The famous Amesbury archer, discovered near Stonehenge, perfectly exemplifies this new Bronze Age elite. Buried around 2300 BC, with over 100 objects, including copper knives, gold ornaments, and the earliest bronze metalworking tools found in Britain, he was clearly someone of enormous importance. Isotope analysis of his teeth revealed he had grown up in the Alps, possibly in what is now Switzerland, yet he was buried with full honours in Britain's most sacred landscape. This tells us something crucial about Bronze Age society. Leadership was becoming international. The most powerful people weren't necessarily local chiefs who had inherited their positions. They were skilled individuals who could navigate complex trade networks and command resources from across Europe. The monuments being built during this period reflect these changing power structures. While Neolithic monuments like Stonehenge had been community projects involving entire populations, Bronze Age monuments were smaller, more exclusive, and clearly associated with individual rulers or family groups. Round barrows, burial mounds for elite individuals, began appearing across the landscape. Some of these contained grave goods worth more than entire villages could produce. The Bush Barrow chieftain, buried just a mile from Stonehenge around 1900 BC, was interred with a gold lozenge, a bronze dagger with a wooden handle decorated with thousands of tiny gold pins, and a ceremonial mace that would have taken months to create. But the Bronze Age wasn't just about elite warriors and exotic trade goods. The period also saw revolutionary changes in how ordinary people lived their daily lives. Permanent settlements became larger and more sophisticated. Houses were built to last for generations rather than seasons. Field systems became more organized and efficient. Most importantly, the population was growing rapidly. The combination of better tools, more reliable food supplies, and expanding trade networks meant that Bronze Age Britain could support far more people than ever before. Archaeological surveys suggest the population may have increased by as much as 10 times during the Bronze Age. This population boom had profound consequences. More people meant more competition for land and resources. It meant more complex social hierarchies. And it meant that when conflicts did arise, they involved larger armies fighting over higher stakes than ever before. The evidence for this increasing militarization is everywhere. Weapon hoards containing dozens of bronze swords, spearheads, and shields have been discovered across Britain. Hill forts, defensive settlements built on high ground, began appearing for the first time. Even everyday tools like axes and hammers were being designed with warfare in mind. Around 1200 BC, something dramatic happened that would bring the Bronze Age to a violent end. Across Europe, Bronze Age civilizations began collapsing. Trade networks broke down. Cities were abandoned. Entire populations disappeared from the archaeological record. Historians call this the Late Bronze Age collapse, and its effects reached all the way to Britain. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was a gradual breakdown that played out over several centuries. Climate change may have played a role, as cooler, wetter conditions made agriculture more difficult. But the primary cause seems to have been the disruption of the trade networks that Bronze Age civilization depended on. Without reliable supplies of copper and tin, bronze production became impossible. Without bronze tools and weapons, the military and technological advantages that had sustained Bronze Age elites disappeared. The complex hierarchies that had developed over centuries began to crumble. But from this collapse came something new: iron. Around 800 BC, the knowledge of iron working reached Britain. Unlike bronze, iron ore was abundant and could be found almost everywhere. Unlike bronze, Iron tools could be made by local blacksmiths rather than specialized craftsmen working with exotic imported materials. The transition to iron democratized technology in a way that would transform British society once again. Farmers could afford better ploughs and harvesting tools. Warriors could equip larger armies with effective weapons. Craftsmen could work with materials that were both cheaper and more versatile than anything that had come before. But iron brought more than just new technology. It brought new people. The Iron Age saw the arrival of the Celts, a collection of tribal peoples who would dominate Britain for the next 1,000 years. The Celts didn't arrive as a single invasion force. Instead, they came in waves over several centuries, sometimes as traders, sometimes as warriors, sometimes as refugees fleeing conflicts on the continent. The Celtic peoples who settled in Britain weren't uniform. They spoke different languages, practiced different customs, and organized themselves into dozens of competing tribes. But they shared certain characteristics that would profoundly influence the development of British culture. The Celts were master ironworkers, capable of producing weapons and tools that surpassed anything the Bronze Age peoples had created. They were skilled farmers who introduced new crops and agricultural techniques that could support even larger populations. They were accomplished artists whose distinctive style can still be recognized in museums across the world. Most importantly, for the future of Britain, the Celts were natural warriors. Their society was organized around warfare, with a warrior elite that valued courage, skill in battle, and personal loyalty above all else. Celtic warriors were feared across Europe for their ferocity and their willingness to fight to the death. The Celtic settlement of Britain wasn't peaceful. Archaeological evidence shows clear signs of conflict as Celtic tribes fought each other for control of territory and resources. Hill forts became larger and more sophisticated, with massive earthwork defences capable of protecting entire communities during siege warfare. Some of these hill forts were truly impressive. Maiden Castle in Dorset covered 47 acres and was protected by multiple rings of earthwork defences up to 20 feet high. The effort required to build such fortifications suggests that Celtic communities were capable of organising and coordinating the labour of thousands of people. But Celtic society wasn't just about warfare. The Celts developed sophisticated legal systems, complex religious practices, and artistic traditions that would influence British culture for centuries to come. They were accomplished poets and storytellers, whose myths and legends would later be incorporated into Arthurian romance and other medieval literature. The Celts also introduced new forms of political organisation. Instead of the Bronze Age system of individual chieftains controlling small territories, Celtic Britain was organised into larger tribal kingdoms with complex hierarchies of nobles, warriors, craftsmen, and farmers. By 100 BC, Celtic Britain had evolved into a patchwork of competing kingdoms, each with its own ruler, its own territory, and its own ambitions for expansion. The stage was set for the conflicts that would define the next phase of British history. But the Celts weren't the only people interested in Britain. Across the English Channel, a new power was rising that would soon cast its eyes toward the mysterious islands in the north. The Romans had conquered most of the known world, and they were beginning to wonder what lay beyond the dangerous waters that separated them from Britain. The collision between Celtic Britain and the Roman Empire would be one of the most significant events in British history. It would bring new technologies, new ideas, and new forms of government that would reshape these islands forever. But it would also trigger centuries of resistance, rebellion, and cultural conflict that would leave scars lasting long after the Roman legions had departed. The ancient world was about to discover that the people of Britain, whether Celtic, Bronze Age, or Neolithic, had never been easily conquered. The Romans were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The year was 55 BC, and Gaius Julius Caesar stood on the beaches of northern Gaul, staring across the churning waters of what the Romans called the ocean. Beyond that treacherous channel lay Britannia, a land so mysterious that most Romans weren't even sure it existed. Some believed it was nothing more than sailors' tales, a phantom island conjured by Celtic imagination and Mediterranean superstition. But Caesar knew better. His spies had brought him stories of a rich land filled with gold, silver, and fierce warriors who fought from horse-drawn chariots. More importantly, he knew that British Celts were sending aid to their continental cousins who dared to resist Roman expansion. If Rome was to truly control Gaul, something would have to be done about the troublemakers across the water. What happened next would echo through history for 2,000 years. Caesar's decision to invade Britain wasn't just military ambition. It was the moment when the isolated world of Celtic Britain collided head-on with the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever produced. The preparations were unlike anything the Romans had attempted before. Caesar's engineers had to design entirely new types of ships capable of crossing the unpredictable waters of the English Channel while carrying horses, siege equipment, and thousands of heavily armed legionaries. The logistics alone were staggering. Coordinating the movement of 80 ships carrying 2 full legions, timing the invasion to coincide with favorable tides and weather, and doing all of this while maintaining complete secrecy. But here's what made this invasion truly extraordinary. The Romans had no maps, no reliable intelligence about the coastline, and no idea what they would find when they landed. They were literally sailing into the unknown. The British Celts, meanwhile, were preparing for something they had never experienced before. Their warriors were accustomed to tribal warfare, raids, cattle rustling, and battles between rival chieftains over territory and honour. The idea of a professional army arriving from across the sea with the intention of permanent conquest was completely outside their understanding of how war worked. When Caesar's fleet appeared off the coast of Kent on that August morning in 55 BC, the Celtic warriors who had gathered to oppose the landing were facing something unprecedented in British history. These weren't raiders who could be bought off with tribute or defeated in a single battle. These were the legions of Rome, and they had come to stay. The landing itself was a disaster. The Roman ships were too large to reach the shore, forcing the legionaries to wade through chest-deep water, while Celtic warriors attacked from the beach. The famous account of the standard-bearer of the 10th Legion leaping into the surf and charging towards shore, inspiring his comrades to follow, captures both the desperation and the determination of that moment. Caesar's first invasion lasted only a few weeks. He achieved nothing more than a precarious foothold on the British coast before autumn weather forced him to withdraw. By Roman standards, it was barely more than an extended raiding party. But the psychological impact was enormous. For the first time in history, Roman eagles had been planted on British soil. The Celts had gotten their first taste of Roman military discipline, and they were terrified. These weren't warriors fighting for glory or cattle. These were professional soldiers who fought as a single unit, who built fortified camps every night, and who seemed to possess an unlimited supply of iron weapons and armour. More importantly, word of Caesar's expedition spread throughout the Celtic world. Suddenly, every tribal chieftain in Britain had to consider the possibility that the Romans might return in greater numbers. The political calculations that had governed Celtic Britain for centuries were no longer valid. Caesar did return the following year, in 54 BC, with a much larger force, 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry transported in over 800 ships. This second invasion was no exploratory raid. Caesar had come to conquer, and he pushed deep into the British interior, crossing the Thames and defeating several Celtic tribes in pitched battles. The Celtic response revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their society. Individual Celtic warriors were brave to the point of recklessness, charging Roman formations with a ferocity that impressed even veteran legionaries. Their war chariots, obsolete everywhere else in Europe, proved surprisingly effective against Roman cavalry in the rough terrain of Britain. But the Celts couldn't match Roman organization and discipline. When Celtic chieftains tried to coordinate their forces, ancient rivalries and competing ambitions undermined their efforts. Cassivellaunus, the war leader chosen to oppose Caesar, spent as much time fighting other Celtic tribes as he did fighting the Romans. The pattern that would define the next 4 centuries of Romano-British relations was already becoming clear. Individual Celtic courage and tactical innovation versus Roman strategic planning and logistical superiority. It was a contest between 2 completely different ways of understanding warfare, politics, and civilization itself. Caesar's second invasion achieved more than the first, but it too ended in withdrawal. The Romans had defeated several tribes, taken hostages, and imposed tribute payments, but they hadn't established permanent control. As winter approached, Caesar once again led his legions back across the Channel, leaving Britain unconquered. For nearly a century after Caesar's expeditions, Britain remained independent. The Romans were busy conquering Egypt, fighting civil wars, and consolidating their control over Gaul. But the idea of completing Caesar's unfinished business never disappeared from Roman thinking. During this period, something fascinating happened in Britain. The threat of Roman invasion, combined with increased contact with the Roman world through trade, began transforming Celtic society in unexpected ways. Some British tribes began adopting Roman customs, Roman technology, and even Roman political structures. The Catuvellauni, led by their king Cunobelinus, established what was essentially a Celtic kingdom organized along Roman lines. They built the first real towns in Britain, complete with paved streets, public buildings, and standardized coinage. They maintained diplomatic relations with Rome, sending embassies to successive emperors, and carefully balancing between independence and accommodation. Other tribes went in the opposite direction, viewing any contact with Rome as a betrayal of Celtic values. The Druids, the powerful priest class who served as judges, teachers, and spiritual leaders throughout the Celtic world, became increasingly militant in their opposition to Roman influence. This split in Celtic society would prove crucial when the Romans finally returned. Some tribes would fight to the death to preserve their independence. Others would welcome Roman rule as an opportunity to gain advantage over their traditional enemies. The Romans, meanwhile, were learning from Caesar's experiences. When Emperor Claudius finally authorized the conquest of Britain in 43 AD, Roman planning was meticulous. 4 full legions, nearly 20,000 professional soldiers, were assembled under the command of Aulus Plautius, one of Rome's most experienced generals. The invasion force that landed at Richborough in Kent was unlike anything Caesar had attempted. Along with the legions came auxiliary troops recruited from across the Roman Empire, including Germanic cavalry, Gallic infantry, and Syrian archers. Engineers brought siege equipment capable of reducing the strongest Celtic hill forts. Supply ships carried everything needed to establish permanent Roman bases. But the most important difference was strategic. Caesar had come as a raider, seeking quick victories and immediate withdrawal. Claudius had come as a conqueror, intending to transform Britain into a Roman province that would remain under Roman control forever. The initial British response seemed almost anticlimactic. The Catuvellauni, who had been the most powerful tribe in southern Britain, collapsed almost immediately. Their king, Caratacus, fled westward to continue resistance from the mountains of Wales. Many other tribes simply submitted without fighting, calculating that accommodation offered better prospects than futile resistance. Within 4 years, Roman control extended across most of lowland Britain. Londinium was founded as a trading centre where the Thames could be easily crossed. Camulodunum became the capital of the new province, complete with a massive temple dedicated to the divine emperor Claudius. Roman roads began snaking across the landscape, connecting military bases and civilian settlements in an efficient network of communication and control. To many observers, it seemed that the conquest of Britain was essentially complete. The Romans had succeeded where Caesar had failed, establishing permanent control over the wealthy southeastern tribes and pushing their frontier steadily westward and northward. But appearances were deceiving. The ease of the initial conquest had lulled the Romans into dangerous overconfidence. They had conquered the most Romanized, most accommodating parts of Britain, but they hadn't yet encountered the fierce resistance that awaited them in the unconquered territories. In the Welsh mountains, Caratacus was building a coalition of tribes determined to drive the invaders back into the sea. In the Scottish Highlands, the Picts and other northern peoples were watching Roman expansion with growing alarm. And in East Anglia, among the Iceni tribe that had initially submitted to Roman rule, a queen named Boudica was beginning to understand exactly what Roman protection really meant. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine whether Britain would become just another Roman province, or whether the fierce independence of the Celtic peoples would prove stronger than Roman military might. The easy victories were over. The real conquest of Britain was about to begin, and when that confrontation came, it would be more savage, more desperate, and more consequential than anyone, Roman or Celt, could possibly have imagined. The fate of Britain hung in the balance, and the decisions made in the next few years would echo through British history for the next 2 millennia. The Celts were about to show the Romans that conquest and control were two very different things. The year 60 AD began like any other in Roman Britain. Tax collectors made their rounds through the prosperous towns of the southeast. Roman merchants traded wine and olive oil for British wool and silver. Veterans of the legions settled into comfortable retirement on farms carved from conquered Celtic lands. For the Romans, it seemed their conquest was not just complete but permanent. They were catastrophically wrong. In the territory of the Iceni, a storm was gathering that would threaten to destroy everything Rome had built in Britain. The Iceni had been one of those tribes that submitted willingly to Roman rule, hoping that cooperation would preserve their autonomy under Roman protection. Their king, Prasutagus, had even made Emperor Nero a co-heir to his kingdom, believing this would ensure his people's safety after his death. But when Prasutagus died in 60 AD, the Romans revealed the true nature of their protection. Instead of honouring the will, Roman officials seized the entire Iceni territory. The dead king's widow, Boudica, was stripped and flogged in public. Her daughters were violated by Roman soldiers. The message was clear: there would be no Celtic nobility under Roman rule, no accommodation, no compromise. This wasn't just brutality, it was a calculated humiliation designed to break the spirit of Celtic resistance forever. The Romans had made similar examples throughout their empire, reducing proud peoples to servile submission through carefully orchestrated displays of overwhelming power. But Boudica wasn't just any Celtic queen. She was a woman who understood that sometimes survival requires total war, and she possessed something the Romans had fatally underestimated: the two unite Celtic tribes that had been enemies for generations. The rebellion began in secret, with messages passed between Iceni settlements using ancient methods that Roman spies couldn't intercept. Druids, the Celtic priests whom Romans had banned but never eliminated, carried word to tribes across eastern Britain. The message was simple but electrifying. The time had come to drive the invaders back into the sea. What made Boudica's rebellion different from previous Celtic uprisings was its scope. This wasn't just the Iceni fighting for their homeland. This was a coordinated revolt involving dozens of tribes stretching from East Anglia to the Thames Valley. For the first time since the Roman invasion, Celtic Britain was truly united. The psychological impact of the uprising was as important as its military strength. Celtic warriors who had accepted Roman rule suddenly remembered what it felt like to fight for their own gods, their own laws, their own freedom. Roman-trained auxiliary troops began deserting their units to join the rebellion. Even some Romans began to wonder whether their empire had overextended itself in trying to hold these distant islands. The first target was Camulodunum, the Roman colonial capital. The city had been built as a symbol of permanent Roman dominance, complete with a massive temple dedicated to the divine Emperor Claudius. Roman veterans had been granted estates carved from Iceni and Trinovantian land, displacing Celtic farmers who were forced to watch their ancestral territories being divided among their conquerors. When Boudica's army appeared outside Camulodunum's walls, the Romans discovered they had made a fatal miscalculation. The city had been built for comfort and commerce, not defense. Its walls were decorative rather than functional. The Roman veterans who lived there were middle-aged former soldiers, whose fighting days were behind them. The massacre that followed was total and deliberate. Every Roman man, woman and child in Camulodunum was killed. The great temple of Claudius was torn down stone by stone. Roman statues were defaced and thrown into ditches. The city itself was burned so thoroughly that archaeologists can still see the destruction layer in excavations today. But this wasn't random violence. It was carefully planned psychological warfare. Boudica understood that the Romans ruled through fear, and she was determined to show that Romans could be made afraid too. The complete destruction of their colonial showcase would send a message throughout the empire. Roman power wasn't invincible. News of Camulodunum's destruction spread panic throughout Roman Britain. The 9th Legion, marching from their base in Lincoln to relieve the city, walked straight into a Celtic ambush. Of the 5,000 men in the legion, only a handful escaped to tell the tale. For the first time since the conquest began, an entire Roman legion had been annihilated on British soil. The momentum was now entirely with the Celts. Tribes that had remained neutral suddenly began joining the rebellion. Roman officials fled their posts. Merchant families abandoned their warehouses and headed for the Channel ports. After 17 years of Roman rule, Britain seemed to be slipping back into Celtic hands. The next target was Londinium, the bustling commercial centre that had grown up around the Thames crossing. Unlike Camulodunum, Londinium wasn't primarily a military installation. It was a trading post where Roman merchants, Celtic craftsmen, and foreign traders from across the empire conducted business in relative harmony. But to Boudica and her followers, Londinium represented everything they despised about Roman rule. It was where Celtic resources were exported to Rome, while British tribes were forced to import Roman goods at inflated prices. It was where Celtic traditions were being diluted by foreign influences. It was where their children were learning to speak Latin instead of their ancestral languages. The Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus faced an impossible choice. His main army was trapped on the island of Anglesey, where he had been conducting a campaign against the Druids. He could try to defend Londinium with the limited forces available, but a siege would likely end in another massacre. Or he could abandon the city and regroup, allowing the rebellion to gain even more momentum. Paulinus made the brutal but strategically correct decision. Londinium would be sacrificed to save the province. Roman officials, merchants, and anyone else who could keep up with the retreating army were evacuated. Everyone else, the sick, the elderly, those too poor to flee, were left to face Boudica's vengeance. The destruction of Londinium was even more complete than that of Camulodunum. Archaeological evidence suggests the entire city was burned in a fire so intense that it melted pottery and bronze objects. The Thames riverfront, lined with warehouses full of goods from across the empire, became a blazing inferno that could be seen for miles. Contemporary Roman historians claimed that 70,000 people died in the sack of Londinium, though this number may be exaggerated. What isn't disputed is the savage nature of the killing. Roman writers describe Celtic warriors practicing ritual torture and captives, the human sacrifice on their hanging Roman women from trees as offerings to their gods. Whether these accounts are accurate or simply Roman propaganda designed to justify later brutal suppression, they reveal something important about how this conflict was understood by both sides. This wasn't just a political rebellion, it was a religious war between incompatible worldviews. From Londinium, Boudica's army moved on to Verulamium, another Roman settlement built on the site of a former Celtic capital. The pattern repeated: total destruction, complete massacre, deliberate desecration of Roman symbols and buildings. Within a matter of weeks, 3 of Roman Britain's most important cities had been wiped from the map. The Celtic forces were now approaching 100,000 warriors, including not just fighting men, but entire families who had joined what they saw as a sacred mission to cleanse their homeland of foreign contamination. This wasn't an army in the traditional sense. It was a migration, a people in arms determined to reclaim their ancestral territories. But Boudica's greatest strength was also becoming her greatest weakness. The massive size of her force made it impossible to coordinate effectively. Different tribes had different objectives, different fighting styles, different ideas about what victory would look like. The very unity that had made the rebellion possible was beginning to fragment under the pressure of success. Meanwhile, Suetonius Paulinus was demonstrating why Rome had conquered most of the known world. Instead of panicking or attempting futile defensive battles, he was methodically concentrating his scattered forces and choosing ground that would favor Roman tactical superiority. The decisive moment came somewhere in the Midlands. Historians still debate the exact location, when Paulinus finally turned to face Boudica's massive army with just 10,000 Roman soldiers. The odds seemed impossible, but Paulinus had chosen his battlefield carefully. The Celts would have to attack uphill across open ground, negating their advantages in numbers and mobility while maximizing Roman discipline and training. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most decisive battles in British history. But it would also be one of the most tragic, because regardless of who won, the Britain that had existed before this conflict could never be restored. Too much blood had been spilled, too much trust had been broken, too many bridges had been burned. The fate of an entire civilization hung in the balance as 2 armies, one fighting for freedom, the other for empire, prepared to settle the question of Britain's future once and for all. Everything that had happened over the previous 2,000 years, from the first Neolithic farmers to the Celtic warriors now facing Roman steel, had led to this moment. The battle was about to begin, and when the dust settled, British history would be forever changed. The clash began at dawn, with the haunting sound of Celtic war horns echoing across the valley. Boudica's warriors, painted with woad and screaming their ancient battle cries, charged down the hillside like a human avalanche. They came in their thousands, warriors wielding long swords and spears, women and children following behind with carts and wagons, druids chanting prayers to gods the Romans had tried to destroy. But Suetonius Paulinus had spent his entire career preparing for moments like this. His legionaries stood in perfect formation, shields locked, javelins ready. When the Celtic charge was just 50 yards away, the Roman commander gave a single, sharp command. 10,000 javelins flew through the morning air like a steel rain, crashing into the front ranks of Boudica's army with devastating effect. The Celtic charge faltered, then broke apart completely as warriors stumbled over their fallen comrades. In that moment of chaos, Paulinus unleashed his masterstroke. The disciplined Roman line advanced steadily forward, cutting through the disorganized Celtic masses with mechanical precision. What had begun as a glorious charge for freedom became a slaughter. The tragedy of Boudica's defeat wasn't just military, it was cultural. As her warriors fell beneath Roman swords, they were taking with them centuries of Celtic tradition, language, and independence. The Druids who died that day carried in their memories the oral histories of dozens of tribes. The chieftains who perished had been the last links to a way of life that stretched back to the Bronze Age. Boudica herself survived the battle, but she knew what Roman vengeance looked like. Rather than face capture, torture, and public execution in Rome, she chose to end her life on her own terms. The exact method remains disputed by historians, but the symbolism was clear. Even in death, she would not submit to Roman authority. The aftermath of Boudica's rebellion was swift and brutal. Suetonius Paulinus unleashed his legions across eastern Britain with orders to crush any remaining resistance. Villages were burned, livestock slaughtered, and entire populations enslaved or killed. The Romans were determined to ensure that no Celtic leader would ever again dare to challenge their authority. But the suppression campaign went too far, even by Roman standards. The systematic destruction of Celtic communities threatened to turn the entire province into a wasteland. Emperor Nero, receiving reports from Britain, realized that Paulinus was destroying the very wealth that made the province valuable to Rome. A new governor was dispatched with orders to restore stability through reconciliation rather than continued violence. The transformation that followed would reshape Britain more profoundly than any military conquest. Instead of ruling through fear alone, Rome began offering Celtic elites a different choice. Cooperation would bring wealth, status, and Roman citizenship. Resistance would bring destruction. The strategy worked brilliantly. Within a generation, Celtic chieftains were sending their sons to Roman schools, building Roman-style villas, and competing for positions in the Roman administration. The same tribal leaders who had once painted themselves blue and charged Roman battle lines were now wearing togas and speaking Latin in Roman courts. This wasn't just political opportunism, it was a fundamental shift in how Celtic society understood power and prestige. Roman culture offered something that Celtic tradition couldn't: access to a wider world of trade, technology, and ideas that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Roman engineers began transforming the British landscape with an efficiency that dwarfed even the great Neolithic monument builders. Roads stretched across the country in perfectly straight lines, connecting military bases, administrative centres, and commercial towns. These weren't just transportation routes, they were symbols of Roman power, physical manifestations of the empire's ability to impose order on the natural world. Hadrian's Wall, begun in 122 AD, represented the ultimate expression of Roman engineering ambition in Britain. Stretching 73 miles across the narrow waste of northern England, it was more than just a defensive barrier. It was a statement that Roman civilization had permanent boundaries that barbarians could not cross. The wall itself was a marvel of construction. Standing 15 feet high and topped with battlements, it incorporated 16 major forts, dozens of smaller installations, and a military road running along its entire length. The logistics of building such a structure were staggering, quarrying millions of tons of stone, transporting materials across difficult terrain, coordinating the work of thousands of soldiers and civilian contractors. But Hadrian's Wall also revealed something important about the limits of Roman power. Despite their technological superiority and military dominance, the Romans couldn't conquer Scotland. The Pictish tribes beyond the wall proved too elusive, too adaptable, and too familiar with their harsh homeland to be defeated by conventional Roman tactics. The failure to conquer Scotland would have profound consequences for British history. It meant that Celtic culture and independence survived in the unconquered territories, providing a constant reminder that Roman rule wasn't inevitable or permanent. It also meant that Roman Britain would always face external threats that could exploit any weakness in imperial defences. South of the wall, however, Roman Britain was flourishing in ways that would have amazed Caesar or even Claudius. Towns like Bath, with its elaborate Roman baths fed by natural hot springs, became centres of Roman culture and luxury that rivaled anything in Italy. Wealthy Romano-British landowners built villas with underfloor heating, elaborate mosaics, and private bath complexes that demonstrated their complete adoption of Roman lifestyle. The economy was booming as well. British wool, silver, and lead were exported throughout the empire, while Roman goods flowed back in return. British craftsmen began producing pottery, metalwork, and jewellery that combined Roman techniques with Celtic artistic traditions, creating a distinctive Romano-British style that was neither fully Roman nor completely Celtic. Perhaps most significantly, Roman Britain was becoming Christian. The new religion had arrived early in the Roman period, probably brought by traders and soldiers from other parts of the empire. By the 4th century, Christianity was spreading rapidly through both Roman and Celtic communities, offering a spiritual alternative that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. The conversion of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century transformed Christianity from a persecuted minority religion into the official faith of the Roman Empire. In Britain, this meant that the same Romano-British elites, who had adopted Roman political and cultural practices, now embraced Roman religious beliefs as well. But Christianity in Britain developed its own distinctive characteristics. Celtic Christian traditions, particularly in Ireland and Scotland, emphasised monasticism, scholarly learning, and missionary activity in ways that differed significantly from Roman Christianity. These differences would become increasingly important as Roman political control began to weaken. By the end of the 4th century, the Roman Empire was facing pressures that even its legendary military machine couldn't handle indefinitely. Barbarian tribes were pressing against Roman frontiers from Germany to the Danube. Economic problems were making it increasingly difficult to maintain the massive armies needed to defend such vast territories. Political instability was weakening central authority and encouraging regional commanders to pursue their own ambitions. Britain, as one of the empire's most distant provinces, was particularly vulnerable to these broader imperial problems. Roman garrisons were gradually withdrawn to defend more strategically important territories closer to the imperial heartland. The wealthy Romano-British elites who had prospered under Roman rule suddenly found themselves responsible for their own defence against Saxon raiders, Scottish invasions, and Irish pirates. The end of Roman rule in Britain wasn't dramatic. There was no final battle, no last desperate siege. Instead, it was a gradual abandonment as imperial resources were redirected elsewhere. The last Roman coins minted in Britain date to around 410 AD. After that, the island that had been part of the Roman Empire for nearly 4 centuries was on its own. What the Romans left behind, however, was a transformed landscape and a transformed people. The road network they had built continued to shape British transportation for centuries. The towns they had founded remained centres of trade and administration. The legal and administrative systems they had established provided the foundation for later British institutions. Most importantly, the Romans had created a unified British identity that transcended the old tribal boundaries. For the first time in history, people living from Cornwall to Hadrian's Wall shared a common language, common laws, and common culture. This Romano-British civilization would provide the foundation for everything that followed. But the departure of the Romans also created a power vacuum that various groups would rush to fill. Saxon raiders were already probing British defences, searching for opportunities to establish permanent settlements. Scottish and Irish tribes were pressing south of Hadrian's Wall, seeking to expand their territories. Even within Roman Britain itself, regional strongmen were beginning to assert independence from any central authority. The stage was set for the next great transformation in British history. The Romano-British civilization that had emerged from the collision between Celtic tradition and Roman authority was about to face its greatest test. New peoples, new cultures, and new ways of organising society were about to reshape these islands once again. The Dark Ages were coming, and with them would come the Anglo-Saxons. Germanic peoples who would bring their own languages, their own gods, and their own ideas about how society should be organised. The encounter between these Saxon settlers and the Romano-British population would create yet another new synthesis, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become England. But that transformation wouldn't be peaceful or easy. The centuries following the Roman departure would be marked by almost constant warfare as different groups fought for control of British territory. It would be an age of legendary figures, both historical and mythical, whose stories would echo through British culture for the next 1,000 years. The Britain that emerged from this chaos would be recognisably different from anything that had come before. yet it would still carry within it traces of all the previous civilizations that had shaped these islands. Celtic traditions, Roman institutions, and Saxon innovations would blend together in unexpected ways, creating the foundation for medieval English society. The collapse of Roman authority in Britain around 410 AD didn't happen overnight. It was more like watching a great building slowly crumble, stone by stone, until one day you realize that what once seemed permanent has simply vanished. But into that vacuum came peoples who would reshape Britain so completely that the very name of the land would change forever. Picture the eastern coasts of Britain in the mid-5th century. Romano-British lookouts, scanning the grey waters of the North Sea, began reporting something that filled them with dread. Ships, not the familiar trading vessels that had connected Britain to the Roman world, but long, narrow warships with dragon-headed prows and striped sails. These were Saxon longships, and they carried warriors who had no interest in preserving what Rome had built. The Anglo-Saxons, that's what historians call the collection of Germanic tribes that began settling in Britain during the 5th century, weren't a single people with a unified plan of conquest. They were Angles from what is now Denmark, Saxons from northern Germany, Jutes from the Jutland Peninsula, and dozens of smaller tribal groups, each with their own kings, their own gods, and their own reasons for leaving their homeland. What drove them to cross the dangerous North Sea wasn't just the lure of British wealth, though the island's reputation for silver, fertile land, and skilled craftsmen certainly played a role. The Germanic peoples were facing pressure from Hun invasions pushing westward across Europe. Coastal flooding was making traditional settlements uninhabitable. Population growth was creating competition for scarce resources. Britain offered what their homeland could no longer provide: space, safety, and opportunity. But here's what makes the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain truly remarkable. Unlike the Roman conquest, which had been a top-down imperial project, this was a grassroots migration. Entire families, entire communities were packing their belongings into longships and sailing toward an uncertain future on a distant island. The first Anglo-Saxon settlements appeared in Kent and along the Thames Valley around 450 AD. These weren't military bases or trading posts. They were farmsteads and villages, complete with women, children, livestock, and household goods. The archaeological evidence is unmistakable. These people had come to stay. The Romano-British response to this migration reveals just how completely Roman authority had collapsed. Instead of coordinated resistance, we see local strongmen hiring Saxon warriors as mercenaries to fight against other Saxon groups. Some Romano-British leaders tried to preserve Roman traditions and institutions. Others embraced Saxon culture and intermarried with Saxon families. Still others retreated to remote areas where they could maintain their independence from both Saxon and Romano-British authority. This patchwork of responses created a Britain that was more fragmented than it had been since before the Roman conquest. Dozens of small kingdoms emerged, some Saxon, some Romano-British, some mixed, each controlling only a few valleys or a single river system. The unified province that Rome had governed for nearly 400 years had shattered into hundreds of competing political units. The cultural transformation was just as dramatic as the political one. The Anglo-Saxons brought with them a completely different way of understanding the world. Where Romano-British society had been urban, commercial, and cosmopolitan, Saxon society was rural, agricultural, and intensely local. Where the Romano-British had worshipped in stone churches and temples, the Saxons honoured gods of war, wisdom, and the hunt in wooden halls and sacred groves. Most importantly, the Anglo-Saxons brought their own languages, Old English dialects that would eventually evolve into the language you're hearing right now. Within just a few generations, Latin was disappearing from everyday use except in religious contexts. The Celtic languages that had survived 4 centuries of Roman rule were being pushed westward into Wales, Cornwall, and Scotland. But this wasn't simply a story of Saxon conquest and Romano-British defeat. Archaeological evidence reveals something much more complex: extensive intermarriage, cultural blending, and gradual assimilation that worked in both directions. Saxon warriors adopted Romano-British farming techniques and craft traditions. Romano-British families learned Saxon languages and customs. The Christianity that had spread throughout Roman Britain began converting Saxon communities, creating new syntheses of Germanic and Christian traditions. The legendary figure of King Arthur, whether he was a real Romano-British leader or a mythical composite of several historical figures, represents this period of cultural collision and synthesis. The Arthurian stories, as they developed over centuries of retelling, captured the essence of what was happening across Britain: the clash between old and new, the struggle to preserve civilization against barbarism, and the hope that heroic leadership could restore unity to a fragmented land. By 600 AD, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had established themselves across most of what would become England. Wessex controlled the southwest, Mercia dominated the Midlands, Northumbria stretched from the Humber to the Scottish border, and East Anglia commanded the rich agricultural lands of the east. Each kingdom had its own royal dynasty, its own laws, and its own ambitions for expansion. These weren't primitive tribal societies. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms developed sophisticated political institutions, legal systems, and cultural traditions that would profoundly influence the development of English civilization. The Anglo-Saxon concept of kingship, based on personal loyalty between warrior and lord, would shape English political culture for centuries. Their legal traditions, emphasizing compensation rather than punishment, would influence English common law. Their poetic traditions would produce masterpieces like Beowulf that still move readers today. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity, beginning with the mission of Augustine to Kent in 597 AD, represents one of the most significant cultural transformations in British history. This wasn't just about changing religious beliefs. It was about connecting Anglo-Saxon Britain to the broader European Christian community and the intellectual traditions of the Mediterranean world. Christianity brought with it literacy, learning, and new forms of artistic expression. Anglo-Saxon monasteries became centers of scholarship that attracted students from across Europe. Illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels combined Germanic artistic traditions with Christian themes in ways that created entirely new forms of beauty. Anglo-Saxon England was becoming one of the most intellectually sophisticated societies in early medieval Europe. But the very success of Anglo-Saxon civilization made it an attractive target for the next wave of raiders and settlers. Just as the Anglo-Saxons had once looked across the North Sea toward the wealth of Roman Britain, now another Germanic people, the Vikings, were preparing their longships for voyages that would once again transform these islands. The first Viking raid struck the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 AD, like a thunderbolt from the clear sky. The attack was perfectly planned and brutally executed. The monastery, located on a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, was wealthy, defenseless, and accessible by sea. The Vikings struck without warning, killed the monks who couldn't flee, looted the treasury, and vanished back across the North Sea before any organized resistance could be mounted. The psychological impact of the Lindisfarne raid went far beyond its immediate military significance. Monasteries were supposed to be sanctuaries protected by God himself. The idea that pagan raiders could attack such sacred places with impunity suggested that either God was powerless to protect his servants, or that he was punishing the English for their sins. But the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were entrepreneurs of violence, and they quickly realized that Britain offered opportunities far beyond simple hit-and-run attacks. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, for all their cultural achievements, were politically fragmented and militarily unprepared for the sustained campaigns that Viking commanders began planning. The great heathen army that landed in East Anglia in 865 AD wasn't just another raiding party. This was a coalition of Viking forces from Denmark, Norway and Sweden, led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, with the explicit goal of conquering and settling Anglo-Saxon territory. The speed of Viking success was breathtaking. Within 5 years, they had captured York, destroyed the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia, and forced Mercia to pay tribute. Only Wessex, under the leadership of a young king named Alfred, remained independent, and even Wessex seemed on the verge of collapse. Alfred the Great, and he truly earned that title, represents one of those pivotal moments when individual leadership changes the course of history. Faced with what seemed like inevitable defeat, Alfred didn't just fight harder, he fought smarter. He revolutionized Anglo-Saxon military organization, created the first English navy, built a network of fortified towns that could resist Viking siege warfare, and most importantly, he united the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under West Saxon leadership. The victory at Edington in 878 AD wasn't just a military triumph, it was a cultural and religious statement. Alfred forced the Viking leader Guthrum to convert to Christianity and accept baptism, symbolically incorporating the Danish settlers into Christian Anglo-Saxon society. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum established the Danelaw, recognizing Danish control over much of northern and eastern England, while preserving Anglo-Saxon independence in the south and west. But Alfred's greatest achievement wasn't military, it was educational. Recognizing that the Viking invasions had devastated Anglo-Saxon learning and culture, Alfred initiated a massive program of translation and education designed to restore English intellectual life. He personally translated works by Augustine, Boethius, and Gregory the Great from Latin into Old English, making classical and Christian learning accessible to English-speaking audiences for the first time. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun during Alfred's reign, represents the first attempt to create a comprehensive history of the English people. Unlike the Latin chronicles produced by monastic scholars, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was written in the vernacular, making it accessible to laypeople and creating a sense of shared English identity that transcended the old tribal and regional boundaries. Alfred's successors, Edward the Elder, Athelstan, and Edgar the Peaceful, built on his foundations to create the first unified English state. By 950 AD, the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been consolidated under West Saxon leadership, creating a political structure that could effectively govern territory stretching from Cornwall to the Scottish border. This unified Anglo-Saxon England represented something genuinely new in British history. Unlike the Celtic tribes or the Roman province, it was a state created by and for the people who lived there. The Anglo-Saxon kings ruled through consent rather than conquest, governing according to laws that applied equally to all free men, regardless of their tribal origins. The economic prosperity of late Anglo-Saxon England was remarkable. Towns like Winchester, York, and London became major commercial centres connected to trade networks that stretched from Ireland to Byzantium. English silver pennies became the standard currency across Northern Europe. English craftsmen produced metalwork, textiles, and manuscripts that were prized throughout the Christian world. But this prosperity and unity also made Anglo-Saxon England an attractive target for the next wave of Scandinavian expansion. The Danish kings Svein Forkbeard and his son Kynot had ambitions that went far beyond the raiding and settling that had characterized earlier Viking activity. They wanted to incorporate England into a North Sea empire that would rival the Carolingian Empire in scope and power. The conquest of England by Cnut in 1016 represents another of those moments when British history could have taken a completely different direction. For a brief period, England was part of a Scandinavian empire that included Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. English nobles served in Danish armies. English ships fought in Scandinavian waters, and English culture was increasingly influenced by Scandinavian traditions. Yet Cnut's empire collapsed almost immediately after his death in 1035, and England reverted to Anglo-Saxon rule under Edward the Confessor. This return to native dynasty seemed to restore the natural order of things. But it also created the succession crisis that would bring the Norman conquest and fundamentally alter English history once again. The Norman conquest of 1066 represents the last successful invasion of England, but it was also much more than that. It was the moment when England was definitively incorporated into the broader European political and cultural system. The isolated, insular Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had developed its own distinctive institutions and traditions was about to be transformed into a key component of a continental empire. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings wasn't just a military triumph. It was a cultural revolution that would affect every aspect of English life. Norman French became the language of the court, the church, and the law. Norman architectural styles transformed English cities and countryside. Norman administrative methods replaced Anglo-Saxon governmental traditions. But perhaps most importantly, the Norman conquest connected England to the intellectual and cultural developments that were transforming medieval Europe. The 12th century Renaissance, the rise of universities, the development of scholastic philosophy, the growth of international trade. All of these movements would profoundly influence English development in ways that might not have happened if England had remained an isolated Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The story we've traced, from Neolithic farmers to Norman conquerors, reveals something fundamental about British history. It's a story of constant change, adaptation, and synthesis. Each wave of settlement and conquest didn't simply replace what came before. It blended with existing traditions to create something new and distinctive. The Britain that William the Conqueror inherited in 1066 carried within it traces of every previous civilization that had shaped these islands. Neolithic monuments still dominated the landscape. Celtic place names survived in every region. Roman roads still connected major settlements. Anglo-Saxon legal traditions continued to influence local government. All of these elements would be incorporated into the Norman synthesis that would create medieval England. But the Norman conquest also represents the beginning of a new phase in British history. The phase that would see the development of parliamentary government, the common law system, the English language as we know it, and eventually the British Empire that would span the globe. The foundations had been laid over thousands of years of cultural development and political experimentation. Now it was time to build something unprecedented in human history, a nation that would reshape the entire world. The Norman conquest didn't just change who ruled England, it fundamentally rewrote the DNA of British civilization. When William of Normandy landed at Pevensey Bay in September 1066, he brought with him not just an army, but an entirely different way of organising society, government, and culture that would echo through British history for the next 1,000 years. But here's what most people don't understand about the Norman conquest. It wasn't just about replacing one king with another. Harold Godwinson's death at Hastings marked the end of 1,000 years of Germanic political tradition in England and the beginning of something completely new, a fusion of Norman efficiency, Anglo-Saxon institutions, and continental European ideas that would create the most powerful kingdom in medieval Europe. The transformation began immediately. Within months of his coronation, William had initiated the most comprehensive survey of land ownership in medieval history. The Domesday Book, completed in 1086, wasn't just a tax record. It was a revolutionary attempt to understand and control every aspect of English society. For the first time since the Roman Empire, a government was systematically cataloguing the resources, population, and economic capacity of an entire nation. The level of detail in Domesday is staggering. It recorded not just who owned what land, but how many ploughs were needed to work it, How many mills ground grain, how many fisheries provided food, even how many pigs could be supported by each forest. This wasn't medieval bureaucracy. This was state building on a scale that wouldn't be matched anywhere in Europe for centuries. But the real genius of Norman administration wasn't just in collecting information, it was in using that information to create a completely new system of government. The feudal system that William imposed on England was more sophisticated and more centralized than anything that had existed in Anglo-Saxon times. Under the Anglo-Saxon kings, England had been governed through personal relationships and ancient customs that varied from region to region. Under the Normans, it became a unified administrative machine where every piece of land, every source of revenue, and every military obligation was precisely defined and systematically managed. This transformation wasn't peaceful. The harrying of the North, between 1069 and 1070, represents one of the most brutal campaigns in English history. When Yorkshire and Northumbria rose in rebellion against Norman rule, William's response was systematic devastation. Villages were burned, livestock slaughtered, agricultural tools destroyed, and populations killed or dispersed. Contemporary chroniclers reported that the region remained uninhabited for decades afterward. The psychological impact was exactly what William intended. The message to every Anglo-Saxon noble, every local leader, every potential rebel was crystal clear. Resistance meant total destruction. But submission meant incorporation into a system that offered opportunities for advancement that had never existed under Anglo-Saxon rule. The Norman transformation of English society went far beyond politics and administration. It revolutionized architecture, law, language, and culture in ways that created the foundation of medieval English civilization. Norman castles began appearing across the landscape, not just military fortifications, but symbols of a new social order based on stone-built permanence rather than wooden halls and temporary settlements. The Tower of London, begun in the 1070s, perfectly exemplified this new Norman approach to power. Unlike Anglo-Saxon royal residences, which had been designed for hospitality and community gathering, the tower was built to dominate and intimidate. Its massive stone walls, rising nearly 100 feet above the Thames, announced to everyone who saw them that Norman rule was permanent, unassailable, and backed by a military technology that no Anglo-Saxon force could challenge. But Norman influence went deeper than impressive buildings. The legal revolution that followed the conquest created the foundation of what would become the English common law system, one of Britain's most important contributions to world civilization. Henry II's legal reforms in the 1160s established royal courts that operated according to consistent principles throughout the kingdom, replacing the patchwork of local customs and tribal laws that had governed Anglo-Saxon England. This wasn't just about efficiency, it was about creating a unified national identity. For the first time since Roman Britain, people living in Cornwall and people living in Yorkshire were subject to the same laws, judged by the same standards, and protected by the same rights. The common law became one of the most powerful forces for creating English unity and English identity. The cultural synthesis that emerged from Norman Anglo-Saxon interaction was equally revolutionary. The Norman French spoken by the conquering elite gradually blended with the Old English of the conquered population to create Middle English, a language that combined Germanic grammar and vocabulary with Romance influences in ways that made it uniquely flexible and expressive. This linguistic fusion reflected a broader cultural transformation. Normaned with Anglo-Saxon craft artistic traditions, mergetsmanship to create distinctive English styles in architecture, sculpture, and manuscript illumination. Norman military techniques combined with Anglo-Saxon administrative traditions to create governmental institutions that were both efficient and responsive to local needs. The Church experienced perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. The Norman conquest connected the English Church directly to the intellectual and spiritual renewal that was sweeping continental Europe. Norman bishops and abbots brought with them the latest developments in theology, philosophy, and ecclesiastical organization. Canterbury Cathedral, rebuilt by the Normans after a fire in 1067, became not just the seat of English Christianity, but one of the great pilgrimage destinations of medieval Europe. The murder of Thomas Becket in 1170 transformed Canterbury into a sacred site that attracted visitors from across Christendom, connecting England to European networks of trade, culture, and religious devotion. The economic transformation was equally profound. Norman England became integrated into continental European trade networks in ways that Anglo-Saxon England had never been. English wool became the foundation of Flemish textile production. English silver financed Norman military campaigns across France. English ports became stopping points for merchants travelling between Scandinavia and the Mediterranean. London experienced explosive growth during the Norman period, evolving from an important Anglo-Saxon town into one of Europe's major commercial centres. The city's strategic position on the Thames, combined with Norman administrative efficiency and continental connections, made it a natural hub for international trade and finance. But the most significant long-term consequence of the Norman conquest was political. The Norman kings of England were also dukes of Normandy, counts of Anjou, and claimants to other French territories. This meant that English political development would be intimately connected to continental European affairs for the next several centuries. The Plantagenet Empire that emerged under Henry II stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, making the English king one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. This vast territorial empire brought English armies into contact with different military traditions, English administrators into contact with different governmental systems, and English culture into contact with the full diversity of medieval European civilization. The consequences of this continental involvement were profound and lasting. English legal traditions influenced French provincial law. English architectural styles spread throughout the Plantagenet territories. English scholars studied at the University of Paris, while continental intellectuals found patronage at English courts. But continental involvement also created tensions that would shape English political development for centuries. The English barons, who held lands in both England and France, found themselves caught between competing loyalties. The enormous cost of defending far-flung territories strained royal finances and forced kings to negotiate with their subjects for tax revenues. These financial pressures created the conditions that led to Magna Carta in 1215, one of the most important documents in the history of constitutional government. King John's military failures in France had cost him most of the Plantagenet territories and bankrupted the royal treasury. When he tried to raise new taxes to fund reconquest campaigns, the barons rebelled and forced him to accept limitations on royal power. Magna Carta established principles that would become fundamental to English and later British constitutional tradition: the rule of law, due process, and the requirement that even kings must govern according to established legal procedures. These weren't democratic principles in any modern sense, but they created the foundation for later constitutional developments that would make Britain a model for representative government worldwide. The baronial wars and constitutional conflicts that followed Magna Carta revealed something crucial about the society that had emerged from Norman Anglo-Saxon synthesis. This wasn't a passive population that could be governed through royal decree. It was a politically sophisticated society with strong traditions of local self-government, legal rights, and collective resistance to arbitrary authority. The development of Parliament during the 13th century represented the institutionalization of these traditions. What began as an expanded royal council for discussing taxation gradually evolved into a representative assembly that claimed the right to participate in all major governmental decisions. The English Parliament that emerged from these developments was unlike anything else in medieval Europe. It combined representation of different social classes, systematic procedures for debate and decision-making, and the practical power to control royal finances. By 1300, no English king could govern effectively without parliamentary cooperation. But parliamentary development also reflected the unique character of English society after 3 centuries of Norman rule. This was a society that combined continental European sophistication with insular English traditions, Norman administrative efficiency with Anglo-Saxon legal customs, and feudal hierarchy with surprisingly broad political participation. The England that entered the 14th century was recognizably the ancestor of modern Britain. Its governmental institutions, legal traditions, economic structures, and cultural characteristics shaped by the had-been Norman synthesis, but were distinctively English rather than simply continental European. The stage was now set for the next great phase of British history, the emergence of England as a major European power with global ambitions. The 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, the Tudor Revolution, and the beginnings of overseas expansion would all build on foundations laid during the crucial centuries following the Norman conquest. The isolated Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had seemed so vulnerable in 1066 had been transformed into one of medieval Europe's most dynamic and innovative societies. The Britain that would eventually rule a quarter of the world's land surface and reshape global civilization was beginning to take recognizable form, but that transformation was still centuries in the future. First, medieval England would have to survive the challenges of plague, civil war, and religious upheaval that would test every institution and tradition that the Norman centuries had created. The real test of the Norman synthesis was yet to come, and it would determine whether the foundations laid between 1066 and 1300 were strong enough to support the weight of global empire. The 14th century dawned with England poised on the brink of greatness, but what came next would test every institution, every tradition, and every assumption that had guided English society since the Norman conquest. The medieval world that had seemed so stable and predictable was about to be shattered by forces that no king, no parliament, and no amount of Norman efficiency could control. It began with something that seemed almost routine, a succession dispute in France. When the last direct Capetian king died in 1328, Edward III of England claimed the French throne through his mother's bloodline. To the English, this seemed like a reasonable assertion of dynastic rights. To the French, it was an intolerable challenge to their national sovereignty. What followed would consume both nations for more than a century and reshape the very nature of warfare, politics, and national identity. The 100 Years' War wasn't really one war. It was a series of conflicts punctuated by truces, treaties, and temporary reconciliations that spanned from 1337 to 1453. But calling it the 100 Years' War misses the point entirely. This was the conflict that transformed England from a medieval kingdom into something entirely new, a nation with global ambitions and the military technology to pursue them. The early English victories at Crécy and Poitiers weren't just tactical triumphs. They were technological revolutions that announced the arrival of a new form of warfare. The English longbow, in the hands of skilled archers drawn from the forests and villages of England and Wales, could penetrate the finest French armour at distances that made traditional cavalry charges suicidal. But here's what made these victories truly revolutionary. They weren't won by knights and nobles fighting for feudal honour. They were won by commoners, farmers, craftsmen, and labourers who had been trained from childhood to draw a bow that required incredible strength and years of practice to master effectively. For the first time in medieval history, the outcome of major battles depended more on popular participation than aristocratic leadership. The social implications were staggering. English archers who had grown up in poverty found themselves celebrated as national heroes after victories like Agincourt in 1415. Common soldiers returned from French campaigns with enough loot to buy land, establish businesses, and challenge traditional social hierarchies. The rigid class structure that had dominated medieval society was beginning to crack under the pressure of military necessity and national mobilization. The financial demands of continuous warfare forced even more dramatic changes in English government and society. Medieval kings were supposed to live of their own, financing government through revenues from royal estates and traditional feudal obligations. But the 100 Years' War cost far more than any traditional revenue sources could provide. Parliament, which had begun as an occasional assembly for extraordinary taxation, became a permanent institution with regular sessions and expanding powers. By 1400, no English king could finance major military campaigns without detailed negotiations with representatives who demanded detailed accounting of how tax revenues would be spent. This wasn't just about money, it was about fundamentally redefining the relationship between rulers and ruled. The English Parliament that emerged from the pressures of the 100 Years' War claimed the right to approve or reject royal policies, investigate governmental misconduct, and even remove kings who failed to govern according to parliamentary expectations. The economic transformation was equally profound. The costs of equipping and maintaining armies in France forced the development of new financial instruments, more sophisticated taxation systems, and closer integration between royal government and commercial networks. English merchants who financed military campaigns expected favourable trading privileges in return. English manufacturers who produced weapons and supplies for the army developed new technologies and expanded their operations. London's role as a financial centre expanded dramatically during this period. Italian banking houses established major operations in London to facilitate the complex international transactions required to support English armies fighting in France. The city's merchants developed new forms of credit, insurance, and international exchange that would later become crucial to English commercial expansion. But the 100 Years' War also revealed the fragility of the medieval world in ways that no one could have anticipated. In 1348, just 11 years after the English victory at Crécy, ships returning from continental campaigns brought something far more devastating than any French army: bubonic plague. The Black Death that swept through England between 1348 and 1350 killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population. Villages were abandoned, fields lay unharvested, and entire families disappeared from historical records. The social and economic disruption was so complete that contemporaries believed they were witnessing the end of the world. But the plague also accelerated social changes that had already begun during the war years. With so many people dead, surviving labourers could demand higher wages and better working conditions. The rigid feudal obligations that had tied peasants to particular estates became impossible to enforce when landowners desperately needed workers and were willing to offer competitive terms to attract them. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 represented the culmination of these social tensions. What began as protests against new taxation to fund the French wars evolved into a general uprising that challenged the fundamental assumptions of medieval social organisation. The rebels who marched on London weren't just demanding lower taxes, they were calling for the complete abolition of serfdom and the establishment of social equality. The revolt was crushed with typical medieval brutality, but its psychological impact was enormous. The idea that common people could organise effective political action, could challenge royal authority, and could articulate coherent alternatives to existing social arrangements had been demonstrated in ways that could never be completely forgotten. Meanwhile, the long military campaigns in France were producing a generation of English leaders with unprecedented experience in international affairs, military organisation, and governmental administration. These weren't provincial nobles, whose horizons extended only to their local estates. These were men who had negotiated with foreign powers, commanded international armies, and administered territories across multiple countries. When these veterans returned to England, they brought with them new ideas about efficient administration, military organisation, and political strategy that would transform English governmental institutions. The Royal Council became more professional and more systematic. Local administration became more centralized and more responsive to royal direction. The English state that emerged from the Hundred Years' War was far more capable of sustained, coordinated action than anything medieval Europe had previously seen. The cultural impact was just as significant. English national identity, which had been gradually developing since the Norman conquest, crystallized during the French wars into something approaching modern patriotism. The English language, which had been slowly displacing French as the language of government and culture, became a symbol of national distinctiveness and cultural independence. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written during the height of the war years, captured this new English cultural confidence perfectly. Here was sophisticated literature, written in English rather than French or Latin, celebrating distinctively English characters, settings, and social situations. The England that Chaucer described was still medieval in its social structure, but it was unmistakably English in its cultural identity. The religious changes that accompanied these political and social transformations were equally revolutionary. John Wycliffe's challenge to papal authority and his translation of the Bible into English reflected a growing sense that English institutions should be independent of foreign control, whether French political control or Italian religious control. The Lollard movement that grew from Wycliffe's teachings represented something new in English religious life. A popular reform movement that challenged not just particular church practices, but the fundamental assumptions about religious authority that had dominated medieval Christianity. The idea that ordinary people could read and interpret Scripture for themselves without clerical mediation was as revolutionary in religious terms as parliamentary taxation was in political terms. By 1400, England had been transformed by a century of almost continuous warfare, social upheaval, and cultural change. The medieval kingdom that had entered the 14th century, with traditional feudal institutions and conventional social arrangements, had evolved into something much more dynamic, much more centralized, and much more capable of sustained collective action. But the end of the Hundred Years' War in 1453 created new problems that would test these transformed institutions in unexpected ways. The professional armies that had fought in France needed new employment. The nobles who had built their careers on military service in continental campaigns needed new sources of wealth and status. The governmental institutions that had been developed to support foreign wars needed new purposes and new sources of legitimacy. The solution that emerged was civil war. The Wars of the Roses, which consumed English politics for the next 30 years, represented, in many ways, the final working out of tensions that had been building throughout the previous century. The conflict between Lancaster and York wasn't just about dynastic succession. It was about what kind of society England would become after the medieval world had been so thoroughly transformed. The battles at St. Albans, Towton, and Bosworth Field were fought with the same military technologies and tactical innovations that had won victories at Crécy and Agincourt. But now, these weapons were turned inward as English armies fought English armies for control of a kingdom whose character had been fundamentally altered by the experiences of the previous century. When Henry Tudor finally ended the civil wars with his victory at Bosworth in 1485, he inherited a kingdom that bore little resemblance to the medieval England that had existed before the Hundred Years' War. This was a centralized state with professional administrative institutions, a politically active parliament, a commercially oriented economy, and a population that had learned to think of itself in distinctively national rather than local or regional terms. The Tudor monarchy that emerged from the Wars of the Roses would build on these foundations to create something unprecedented in European history, a unified nation-state capable of projecting power on a global scale. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the beginnings of overseas expansion would all be made possible by the governmental institutions, social structures, and cultural attitudes that had been forged during the crucible years of the 14th and 15th centuries. But the transformation wasn't complete yet. The England that Henry VII ruled in 1485 was still recognizably medieval in many ways. It would take another century of religious upheaval, political consolidation, and cultural revolution to create the early modern England that would challenge Spanish power, colonize North America, and lay the foundations for global empire. The medieval world was ending, but what would replace it was still being born. The England that would eventually rule the seas and reshape the globe was emerging from the ashes of feudalism, but its final form remained to be determined by the choices that future generations would make about religion, politics, and national destiny. The stage was set for the Tudor Revolution, but that story, the story of how medieval England became early modern Britain, was still waiting to be written. And when it was written, it would be written by kings and queens whose understanding of power, authority, and national purpose had been shaped by everything that had come before. From Neolithic monument builders to Norman administrators to the battle-hardened veterans of the 100 Years' War, the foundations of global empire were in place. Now it remained to be seen what would be built upon them. When Henry VII claimed the English throne after his victory at Bosworth Field in 1485, he wasn't just ending a civil war. He was inheriting a kingdom that stood on the threshold of the most dramatic transformation in its entire history. The England that had emerged from the medieval crucible was about to become something that would have been unimaginable to the Norman conquerors or even the Plantagenet kings, a global superpower that would reshape civilization itself. But here's what makes the Tudor Revolution so extraordinary. It wasn't planned. Henry VII had no grand vision of English ships exploring unknown oceans or English colonies spanning continents. He was focused on much more immediate concerns: staying alive, consolidating power, and establishing a dynasty that could survive the brutal realities of early modern politics. The England that Henry inherited was still dangerous, still fractured, still recovering from 30 years of intermittent civil warfare. Pretenders to the throne emerged regularly, backed by foreign powers eager to destabilize English politics. The royal treasury was nearly empty. The nobility, bloodied but not broken by the Wars of the Roses, remained a constant threat to royal authority. Yet within this apparent weakness lay hidden strengths that would soon transform England into Europe's most dynamic kingdom. The civil wars had eliminated many of the great feudal families that had dominated medieval politics, creating opportunities for new men with new ideas about government, commerce, and national purpose. The financial pressures of continuous warfare had forced the development of more sophisticated taxation systems and more efficient administrative structures. The political upheavals had created a governing class that understood the importance of adaptability, innovation, and ruthless efficiency. Henry VII's genius lay not in dramatic gestures or revolutionary policies, but in his methodical approach to rebuilding royal power. He systematically eliminated potential rivals, negotiated favourable trade agreements, and accumulated wealth with the dedication of a successful merchant. The court that he established was more like a business enterprise than a medieval royal household, efficient, profitable, and focused on long-term strategic planning rather than chivalric display. The economic transformation that occurred during Henry's reign laid the groundwork for everything. English that follow merchants, encouraged by royal policy and protected by increasingly effective royal administration, began expanding traditional European, their operations beyond the wool trade that had thin markets. 100 Years' War evolved network that connected into a more diversified commercial to English producers to markets from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. London's growth during this period was spectacular. The city that had been devastated by plague and civil war experienced a renaissance that transformed it into one of Europe's major commercial centres. New built to handle increasing trade. Banking volumes of international docks were houses established operations to finance increasingly complex commercial ventures. Craftsmen and manufacturers expanded their operations to serve both domestic and export markets. But the most significant development was the emergence of a new class of English entrepreneurs who combined commercial ambition with political sophistication. These weren't traditional merchants content to operate within established trade routes. These were innovators willing to risk enormous investments in untested markets and unproven technologies. Their willingness to experiment with new forms of business organization would soon make possible the joint stock companies that would finance English colonial expansion. The religious revolution that began under Henry VIII represented far more than just a royal divorce crisis. When Henry broke with Rome in the 1530s, he wasn't just asserting his personal authority. He was fundamentally redefining the relationship between England and the rest of Europe. For the first time since the Norman conquest, England would develop its own distinctive institutions without reference to continental European models. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 represented one of the largest transfers of wealth in English history. Monastic lands that had been held in perpetuity by religious communities were suddenly available for purchase by anyone with sufficient capital. This created opportunities for social mobility on a scale that medieval England had never experienced. The families that acquired former monastic properties weren't just buying land. They were buying entry into the political and social elite that would govern Tudor and Stuart England. Many of these new landowners came from commercial backgrounds, bringing with them business skills and entrepreneurial attitudes that would transform English rural society. The England that emerged from the dissolution was far more commercially oriented, far more socially mobile, and far more willing to challenge traditional authority than anything that had existed before. The cultural impact of the English Reformation was equally profound. The translation of the Bible into English, the establishment of vernacular church services, and the development of distinctively English religious traditions created a sense of national identity that was both more inclusive and more exclusive than anything medieval England had known. For the first time, ordinary English people could participate directly in religious life without clerical mediation. This democratization of religious experience had political implications that extended far beyond church affairs. If common people could read and interpret Scripture for themselves, why shouldn't they also have opinions about government policy, economic regulation, and social organization? The reign of Elizabeth I represented the culmination of these Tudor transformations. When she came to the throne in 1558, Elizabeth inherited a kingdom that had been religious-politically destabilized by the rapid changes of the previous 30 years. Catholics still hoped for a return to papal authority. Protestants demanded more radical reforms. Foreign powers plotted invasion and subversion. The very survival of an independent English state seemed doubtful. Elizabeth's solution was to create a uniquely English synthesis that combined religious moderation with political pragmatism and national assertiveness. The Elizabethan religious settlement established a church that was Protestant in theology but Catholic in structure, satisfying moderate opinion while avoiding the extremes that had torn other European countries apart. More importantly, Elizabeth understood that England's survival depended on its ability to project power beyond its own borders. The Spanish Empire that dominated the 16th century world had grown rich and powerful by exploiting the resources of the Americas. If England was to remain independent, it would need to develop its own sources of wealth and its own means of challenging Spanish hegemony. The solution was the sea. England's geographic position as an island had always been both a protection and a limitation. Now it became a launching pad for global expansion. The English privateers who raided Spanish shipping weren't just pirates. They were the advance guard of a new form of warfare that would eventually challenge Spanish control of the world's oceans. Francis Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 wasn't just an impressive feat of navigation. It was a demonstration that English seamanship could compete with anything the Spanish or Portuguese could achieve. When Drake returned to Plymouth with his ship loaded with Spanish treasure, he brought back more than gold and silver. He brought back proof that the Spanish Empire was vulnerable and that English enterprise could succeed on a global scale. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 marked the moment when England announced itself as a major European power with global ambitions. The victory wasn't just military, it was psychological, cultural, and economic. For the first time since the Norman conquest, England had successfully defended itself against a major continental invasion. But more than that, England had demonstrated that its naval technology, seamanship, and national organisation were superior to those of the world's greatest empire. The economic consequences of the Armada victory were immediate and far-reaching. English merchants who had previously operated in the shadow of Spanish power suddenly found themselves free to explore new markets and establish new trade routes. The joint stock companies that were formed in the aftermath of the victory, the Muscovy Company, the Levant Company, the East India Company, would become the vehicles for English commercial expansion across the globe. But the cultural impact was even more significant. The England that celebrated the defeat of the Armada was no longer the isolated medieval kingdom that had existed before the Tudor Revolution. This was a nation that understood its own power, its own potential, and its own destiny. The plays of William Shakespeare, the poetry of Edmund Spenser, and the prose of Richard Hakluyt all reflected this new English confidence and global awareness. The Elizabethan age wasn't just about military victories and commercial expansion. It was about the emergence of a distinctively English culture that combined medieval traditions with Renaissance innovations in ways that created something entirely new. The Globe Theatre, where Shakespeare's plays were performed, wasn't just an entertainment venue. It was a space where English audiences could explore questions about power, authority, love-ition, and mortality that reflected their own rapidly changing world. The literature of the Elizabethan period captured the excitement and uncertainty of living through revolutionary times. Shakespeare's history plays explored the lessons of the Wars of the Roses for audiences who were witnessing the emergence of England as a major European power. His tragedies examined the psychological costs of ambition and power in a world where traditional certainties were being challenged. His comedies celebrated the possibilities for social mobility and personal transformation that the New England offered. But perhaps most importantly, Elizabethan culture was vernacular culture. Unlike medieval literature, which had been written primarily in Latin or French for clerical and aristocratic audiences, Elizabethan writers used English to address English concerns for English readers. This cultural nationalism reflected and reinforced the political and religious nationalism that was transforming England into a unified nation-state. The exploration and colonization efforts that began during Elizabeth's reign represented more than just commercial ventures. They were attempts to extend English civilization to new continents and new populations. The failed colony at Roanoke, the establishment of trading posts in India, and the early expeditions to North America all reflected a growing English conviction that their political institutions, religious traditions, and cultural values were worth spreading beyond the British Isles. When Elizabeth died in 1603, she left behind a kingdom that had been transformed beyond recognition. The England that James I inherited was no longer a medieval monarchy struggling to maintain its independence against continental European powers. It was an early modern nation-state with global ambitions, sophisticated governmental institutions, a dynamic commercial economy, and a confident national culture. The union of the English and Scottish crowns under James I created new opportunities for expansion and consolidation. For the first time since the Roman period, the entire island of Britain was under unified political control. The elimination of the Anglo-Scottish border as a military frontier freed resources for overseas expansion and colonial development. The establishment of permanent English colonies in North America during James's reign, Jamestown in Virginia, Plymouth in Massachusetts, represented the beginning of what would become the largest empire in human history. These early settlements weren't just trading posts or military outposts. They were attempts to recreate English society in new environments, complete with English laws, English institutions, and English cultural traditions. But the success of these colonial ventures depended on the governmental institutions, commercial networks, and cultural confidence that had been developed during the previous century of Tudor rule. The England that could successfully establish permanent settlements in North America was the England that had survived the Reformation, defeated the Spanish Armada, and created a national culture capable of adapting to new challenges and new opportunities. The civil wars of the 1640s would test these institutions in ways that no one could have anticipated, but they would also demonstrate the fundamental strength of the political and cultural synthesis that had emerged from the Tudor Revolution. Even when traditional monarchical authority collapsed completely, English society proved capable of governing itself, defending its interests, and maintaining its global commitments. The England that emerged from the civil wars and the Restoration was recognizably the ancestor of the global empire that would dominate the 18th and 19th centuries. The political institutions, commercial practices, and cultural attitudes that had been forged during the Tudor period would provide the foundation for unprecedented expansion and influence. But that story, the story of how early modern England became the British Empire, was still waiting to be written by future generations who would build upon the foundations that had been laid during the revolutionary century between 1485 and 1603. The transformation from medieval kingdom to early modern nation-state was complete. Now it remained to be seen what kind of empire would be built upon these foundations and what kind of world would emerge from the collision between English institutions and global opportunities. The stage was set for the next great act in British history, but the script was still being written by events that no Tudor monarch could have foreseen or controlled. The England that had learned to rule the seas was about to discover what it meant to rule the world. The 17th century opened with England poised between two worlds. The medieval past it had finally left behind, and the global future it was only beginning to imagine. When James I united the English and Scottish crowns in 1603, he inherited something unprecedented, a unified British Isles with the resources, institutions, and ambitions necessary to challenge the established powers of Europe and beyond. But unity on paper and unity in practice proved to be very different things. James's vision of absolute monarchy, imported from Scotland, collided immediately with the parliamentary traditions and commercial interests that had been developing in England for centuries. The king who believed he ruled by divine right found himself governing a nation that had learned to think of political authority as something that required consent, negotiation, and continuous justification. The tension between royal ambition and parliamentary authority would define British politics for the next century, but it would also drive the innovations in government, finance, and military organisation that made global empire possible. The very conflicts that seemed to threaten political stability actually strengthened the institutional foundations that would support unprecedented expansion and influence. James's early colonial ventures revealed both the potential and the problems of English overseas expansion. The Virginia Company that established Jamestown in 1607 represented a new form of business organization that combined private investment with royal charter, spreading risk while concentrating resources in ways that individual merchants or traditional government funding could never achieve. The joint stock company model that emerged from these early experiments would become the engine of English commercial expansion. Unlike the Spanish system, which relied on direct royal control and exploitation of precious metals, the English approach emphasized trade, settlement, and the development of diverse economic activities that could generate sustainable long-term profits. But the early colonial experience also revealed the brutal realities of expansion. The Jamestown colonists, who survived the starving time of 1609 to 1610, did so only by imposing martial law, enslaving local populations, and eventually importing African labourers to work tobacco plantations. The wealth that began flowing back to England was built on foundations of violence and exploitation that would shape colonial relationships for centuries. The religious divisions that had been partially contained during Elizabeth's reign erupted with new intensity under Charles I. The Pou James and his son Retons, who had hoped for further Protestant reforms, found themselves increasingly alienated from royal policies that seemed to favour Catholic traditions and continental European influences. Their response was to seek new opportunities for creating godly communities in the American wilderness. The Great Migration that brought 20,000 Puritans to New England between 1630 and 1640 wasn't just about religious freedom. It was about creating an alternative model of English civilization that could serve as an example for reform back home. The Massachusetts Bay Colony that John Winthrop envisioned as a city upon a hill represented both an escape from English corruption and a laboratory for perfecting English institutions. These colonial experiments in self-government had profound implications for political development, both in America and in Britain itself. Colonial assemblies that began as practical necessities for managing local affairs gradually evolved into representative institutions that claimed rights and privileges comparable to those of Parliament itself. The political traditions that would eventually produce American independence were being established by English colonists who saw themselves as preserving English liberties against royal tyranny. Meanwhile, Charles I's attempts to govern without Parliament created a constitutional crisis that revealed just how much English political culture had changed since the medieval period. When the king tried to raise revenue through forced loans, ship money, and other non-parliamentary taxes, he encountered resistance that went far beyond simple opposition to particular policies. The English Civil Wars that began in 1642 represented something unprecedented in European history. The systematic overthrow of monarchical government by parliamentary forces representing commercial and professional classes rather than traditional feudal nobility. This wasn't just a rebellion or a dynastic dispute. It was a revolution that challenged fundamental assumptions about political authority, social hierarchy, and religious organization. The execution of Charles I in 1649 sent shockwaves throughout Europe and announced that England had moved decisively beyond the traditional boundaries of monarchical government. For the first time since the Roman Republic, a major European power was attempting to govern itself without hereditary royal authority. The Commonwealth and Protectorate periods under Oliver Cromwell demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of republican government in 17th century conditions. Cromwell's military genius and administrative efficiency proved that England could defend its interests and pursue its ambitions without traditional monarchical institutions. The conquest of Ireland, the subjugation of Scotland, and the successful wars against Spain and the Netherlands showed that republican England could project power as effectively as any monarchy. But the Commonwealth also revealed the social and cultural tensions that monarchy had helped to contain. Religious sectarians who had been united in opposition to royal authority began fighting among themselves about the proper organization of church and state. Regional differences that had been managed through traditional hierarchical relationships erupted into open conflicts about taxation, representation, and local autonomy. The economic policies of the Commonwealth period had lasting consequences that extended far beyond the political experiments of the 1650s. The Navigation Acts that required colonial trade to float English ships represent through English ports and a systematic attempt to organize global commerce for national advantage. These weren't just protectionist measures. They were the foundation of what would become the most sophisticated system of imperial economic management in world history. The Dutch Wars of the Commonwealth and Restoration periods marked England's emergence as a serious naval power capable of challenging the established maritime empires. The battles fought between English and Dutch fleets in the North Sea and the English Channel weren't just about trade routes or colonial territories. They were about which nation would dominate the emerging global economy. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, he inherited a kingdom that had been fundamentally transformed by 20 years of revolutionary government. The monarchy that returned was nothing like the personal rule that his father had attempted. This was a constitutional monarchy that governed through Parliament, depended on commercial prosperity, and pursued national interests rather than dynastic ambitions. The Great Fire of London in 1666 provided an unexpected opportunity to demonstrate the new relationship between royal authority and national reconstruction. Christopher Wren's plan for rebuilding the city reflected the scientific rationalism and commercial pragmatism that were becoming characteristic of Restoration England. The new London that rose from the ashes wasn't just a medieval city rebuilt. It was a modern commercial centre designed to facilitate the global trade that was becoming Central Revolution, that flower to English prosperity. The scientific-ish during the Restoration period wasn't separate from political and economic developments. It was intimately connected to the practical needs of navigation, engineering, and manufacturing that global expansion required. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, brought together natural philosophers, merchants, craftsmen, and government officials in collaborative investigations that advanced both theoretical knowledge and practical applications. Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, represented more than just a breakthrough in mathematical physics. It demonstrated that English intellectual culture could compete with anything produced on the continent. The same systematic approach to understanding natural phenomena that made Newtonian physics possible was being applied to problems of government, commerce, and imperial administration. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 represented the final resolution of the constitutional conflicts that had dominated 17th century politics. When Parliament invited William of Orange to replace James II, they weren't just changing dynasties. They were establishing definitively that monarchical authority depended on parliamentary consent and constitutional limitations. The Bill of Rights that followed William's accession codified principles that had been developing throughout the century. Regular parliamentary sessions, freedom of speech in Parliament, the right of petition, and prohibitions on excessive bail and cruel punishments. These weren't just English liberties. They were becoming the foundation for constitutional government throughout the English-speaking world. The financial revolution that accompanied the Glorious Revolution created the institutional foundations for sustained global expansion. The Bank of England, established in 1694, provided mechanisms for government borrowing that could finance long-term military campaigns and colonial development. The national debt that emerged from these innovations wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a source of strength that allowed England to mobilize resources on a scale that no other European power could match. The War of the Spanish Succession that began in 1701 marked England's emergence as the dominant European power and the leading global empire. The Duke of Marlborough's victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde demonstrated that English military organisation could defeat the armies of Louis XIV, the most powerful monarch in Europe. But the real significance of the war lay in its global dimensions. English forces fought not just in Europe, but in North America, the Caribbean, and the Mediterranean. The Treaty of Utrecht that ended the war in 1713 confirmed English control of Gibraltar, Minorca, Hudson Bay, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia, strategic positions that would anchor English power in every major theatre of global competition. The union with Scotland in 1707 created the United Kingdom of Great Britain, combining English commercial and naval power with Scottish intellectual and entrepreneurial energy. The Act of Union wasn't just a political merger. It was the creation of a unified British identity that could support imperial expansion on an unprecedented scale. The Scotland that joined England in 1707 brought distinctive contributions that would prove crucial to imperial success. Scottish universities were producing some of Europe's most advanced thinkers in philosophy, economics, and natural science. Scottish merchants and soldiers were eager for opportunities that the English Empire could provide. Scottish religious traditions emphasized education and moral improvement in ways that would shape colonial policies throughout the British Empire. By 1714, when the Hanoverian dynasty succeeded to the British throne, the foundations established. The political of global empire were firmly institutions that had emerged from a century of constitutional conflict provided stable, efficient government that could coordinate complex military and commercial operations across vast distances. The financial system that had developed during the wars against Louis XIV could mobilize capital for colonial development and imperial defense. The cultural confidence that had grown from successful resistance to continental European domination supported ambitious projects for extending British civilization to new continents and new populations. The Britain that George I inherited was no longer just another European kingdom competing for regional advantage. It was a global power with worldwide interests, worldwide commitments, and worldwide opportunities. The Industrial Revolution, the American colonies, the conquest of India, and the abolition of slavery were all made possible by the institutional foundations that had been laid during the transformative century between 1603 and 1714. But the full implications of these developments wouldn't become clear until the 18th and 19th centuries, when the British Empire would expand to encompass a quarter of the world's land surface and a quarter of its population. The revolution in government, finance, and military organization that had begun with the English Civil Wars would ultimately reshape global civilization in ways that no 17th century politician could have imagined. The stage was now set for the final act in our story. The transformation of Great Britain from a European power with global interests into a world empire that would define the modern age. But that transformation would require another century of war, innovation, and expansion that would test every institution and every assumption that had been developed during the previous 1,000 years of British history. The Britain that would rule the waves and govern a global empire was finally ready to be born, but its birth would come through struggles that would make the English Civil Wars seem like mere rehearsals for the real drama of imperial expansion and global responsibility that lay ahead. The 18th century dawned with Britain standing at the edge of something that had never existed before in human history: the possibility of truly global dominance. But this wasn't the gradual expansion of a medieval kingdom or the territorial ambitions of a European dynasty. This was the emergence of an entirely new form of power, industrial, commercial, and technological, that would reshape not just Britain, but the entire world. George I's accession in 1714 marked more than just another royal succession. It represented the final triumph of the constitutional and financial systems that had been forged during the previous century of upheaval. The Hanoverian monarchy that emerged from this settlement wasn't interested in divine right or absolute authority. It was a business partnership between crown, parliament, and the emerging commercial classes that would prove more effective at accumulating and projecting power than any previous form of government. The genius of this system lay not in its ideology, but in its efficiency. While other European powers were still struggling with the limitations of feudal taxation and aristocratic military service, Britain had developed mechanisms for mobilizing resources that seemed almost unlimited. The national debt that had emerged from the wars against Louis XIV became a source of strength rather than weakness, allowing the government to borrow against future prosperity in ways that could finance immediate expansion. The South Sea bubble crisis of 1720 might have destroyed this financial system before it could prove itself, but instead, it strengthened British institutions by demonstrating their resilience and adaptability. The speculative mania that drove South Sea Company's stock to impossible heights before crashing spectacularly taught British investors crucial lessons about risk management and long-term planning that would serve them well in future colonial ventures. More importantly, the crisis revealed something fundamental about British society. It had become comfortable with innovation, experimentation, and calculated risk-taking in ways that more traditional societies could never match. The merchants, manufacturers and financiers who emerged from the South Sea debacle weren't discouraged from future ventures. They were educated about how to pursue them more effectively. The agricultural revolution that transformed British farming during this period provided the foundation for everything that followed. New crops like turnips and potatoes, new techniques like crop rotation and selective breeding, and new organisational methods like enclosure and consolidation created unprecedented agricultural productivity that could support both population growth and industrial development. But the enclosure movement that drove this agricultural transformation also created the social conditions necessary for industrialisation. Displaced rural workers who had lost access to common lands were forced to seek employment in towns and cities, providing the labour force that emerging industries desperately needed. This wasn't just economic change. It was social engineering on a massive scale that created the world's first industrial society. The population explosion that accompanied these agricultural improvements was staggering. Britain's population nearly doubled during the 18th century, growing from about 5 million to over 9 million. But unlike previous population booms, which had typically led to famine and social collapse, this growth was sustained by increasing productivity and expanding economic opportunities. The transportation revolution that connected these growing populations was equally remarkable. The canal systems that crisscrossed Britain by 1800 weren't just engineering marvels. They were economic arteries that could move coal, iron, textiles, and agricultural products with an efficiency that reduced costs and expanded markets in revolutionary ways. The Duke of Bridgewater's canal connecting his coal mines to Manchester didn't just make him wealthy. It demonstrated that private investment in infrastructure could generate profits while serving national economic interests. But the real transformation was happening in the workshops and manufactories where British craftsmen were developing new ways of organising production. The putting out system that had dominated textile manufacturing for centuries was giving way to factory production that concentrated workers, machinery, and materials in single locations where they could be coordinated with unprecedented precision and efficiency. The spinning jenny, the water frame, and the power loom weren't just mechanical innovations. They were components of an integrated system that could produce textiles faster, cheaper, and in greater quantities than anything the world had ever seen. The cotton mills of Lancashire and Yorkshire became the wonder of Europe, attracting visitors who came to marvel at machines that seemed to operate with almost magical efficiency. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine in the 1760s provided the power source that would liberate British industry from dependence on watermills and seasonal variations in river flow. Steam power meant that factories could be located wherever transportation and labour were most advantageous, rather than where nature provided flowing water. This flexibility in location became crucial as industrial production expanded beyond traditional craft centres. The iron and coal industries that supported this industrial expansion grew with equal rapidity. Abraham Darby's innovations in smelting iron with coke rather than charcoal eliminated the fuel bottlenecks that had limited previous iron production. The result was a dramatic reduction in iron prices that made possible the construction of steam engines, factory machinery, and transportation infrastructure on scales that would have been economically impossible just decades earlier. The social consequences of these industrial transformations were as dramatic as the technological ones. The emergence of distinct working and middle classes created new forms of social organisation, new political interests, and new cultural identities that would shape British society for centuries. The factory workers who crowded into industrial towns like Manchester and Birmingham weren't just employees. They were members of a new social class whose interests often conflicted with those of their employers and the traditional landed gentry. The wealth that flowed from industrial production created opportunities for social mobility that medieval Britain could never have imagined. Successful manufacturers like Josiah Wedgwood and Matthew Boulton accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of established aristocratic families, while skilled workers could aspire to economic independence and social respectability that had been impossible under traditional craft systems. But industrial wealth also created new forms of inequality and social tension. The working conditions in early factories were often brutal, with long hours, dangerous machinery, and unhealthy environments that took terrible tolls on workers' health and life expectancy. The environmental degradation that accompanied rapid industrialization turned once pleasant countryside into polluted wastelands that shocked contemporary observers. The global implications of British industrial development became apparent as factory production created demands for raw materials and markets that could only be satisfied through imperial expansion. The cotton mills of Manchester needed raw cotton from America, the Caribbean, and eventually India. The iron foundries of Birmingham needed markets for their products that stretched from Canada to Australia. Industrial Britain was becoming dependent on global trade networks that required political control or influence over vast territories. The 7 Years' War that erupted in 1756 represented the first truly global conflict in human history, with British and French forces fighting simultaneously in Europe, North America, India, and the Caribbean. But this wasn't just another European dynastic struggle. It was a competition for control of the emerging global economy that industrial development was creating. The British victories that culminated in the Treaty of Paris in 1763 established British dominance over North America and India, while eliminating France as a serious competitor for global imperial control. The acquisition of Canada, Florida, and effective control over large parts of India provided the territorial foundation for an empire that could supply raw materials to British factories while purchasing British manufactured goods. But imperial expansion also created new problems that tested British political institutions in unexpected ways. The American colonists who had helped win the 7 Years' War expected to be treated as partners in the expanded empire, not as subordinates whose primary function was to serve British economic interests. When Parliament attempted to tax the colonies to help pay for imperial defence, it triggered a constitutional crisis that revealed fundamental contradictions in British imperial theory. The American Revolution that began in 1775 represented more than just a colonial rebellion. It was a challenge to the entire system of imperial governance that Britain had been developing for over a century. The colonists who declared independence in 1776 weren't rejecting British civilization. They were claiming to represent authentic British political traditions against a corrupt imperial government that had abandoned constitutional principles. The loss of the American colonies in 1783 could have been a devastating blow to British imperial ambitions, but instead it forced a fundamental reconsideration of imperial policy that would make the 19th century empire far more successful than its 18th century predecessor. The lessons learned from the American experience about the importance of local autonomy, economic integration, and cultural adaptation would guide British imperial development for the next century. Meanwhile, the French Revolutionary Wars that began in 1792 created new opportunities for British expansion while testing every institution that had been developed since the Glorious Revolution. The ideological challenge that revolutionary France posed to traditional European political systems forced Britain to mobilize resources on a scale that dwarfed even the 7 Years' War. The Royal Navy that emerged from these conflicts was unlike anything that had ever existed, a global force capable of projecting British power to every ocean while protecting British commerce from interference by hostile powers. The victories at the Nile and Trafalgar didn't just defeat French naval power, they established British control over the world's sea routes that would last for the next century. From ancient stone circles to the first industrial revolution, from Celtic warriors to global empire, we've witnessed the most extraordinary transformation in human history. A remote island that once seemed isolated from the world became the force that would reshape civilization itself. Every invasion, every conquest, Every revolution built upon the foundations laid by those who came before, creating something that had never existed, a nation capable of ruling the waves and governing a quarter of the globe. This is more than just British history. It's the story of how our modern world was born, forged in the crucible of these islands over thousands of years of conflict, innovation, and relentless ambition.